So I got some catch up to do. I've got to do a services lecture, which I was supposed to do last class, but I had to put off. Um, and then still want to get web forensics done. I'm pushing off email till later, so I've kind of pushed it way down here. Womp womp. What does that mean? What does womp womp mean? The only thing I can think of is like, the deep bass or something. Woom, woom. Zoomer terms. I see how it is. Zoomers. Yeah, my kids are Zoomers. Some of them. I got a Gen Alpha and a Zoomer, two Zoomers, and they hate my daughter hates being called a Zoomer because she likes to use the term boomer. So even though I'm not a boomer, I'm a Gen X. Get it right, right? All right, so I'll start with services. That's going to be pretty basic. Basically, oh well with zero empathy. Interesting. Okay. Oldest Gen X versus youngest Zoomer. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I get where you're coming from there. I'm actually, no, where am I? Yeah, I'm one of the younger Gen X's. Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. All right, so let's do this thing. Um, where am I? What's going on? So live response, processes and services. We did processes. We're getting into services now. I'm booting up my VM just for kind of walking around it a little bit, walking the dog. I just like to poke around a little bit before instead of just using the slides because you can kind of just explore a little bit more. Okay, so services are just processes that are running in the background that not only do you not need to interact with them, but for the most part, you're not really supposed to, right? So they kind of do their thing, and as a user, you kind of do yours. And if we're lucky, never the two shall meet, and everything just works happily. So the thing is, a lot of malware will hide itself in by pretending to be a service or actually being a service or hijacking a service, right? So we want to be able to pay attention to those, and it's useful to understand how they work. Okay, so we'll talk about the difference between a user and a system process, which we've talked about a little bit already because we talked about processes. We'll list some user contexts of several user contexts of a system process and describe what a system service does. That's actually pretty generic because they can do a lot of things, right? But we'll kind of break down how they're registered and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so a system service is just like I said, it's a process that runs separately from the user interface. So it's not really interacting with the GUI. It can be made to interact with the GUI, but that's not considered good practice. Um, so I have seen instances where that's been configured that way. It's usually it means that the user is able to interfere with things, which is not a great idea. So they're typically designed to not require user input or intervention. And services.msc is your friend, but it's not the only game in town. Everything that you need to do can be done there. But if you're gathering information, it's not the best way. Like if you're just trying to dump a bunch of information about processes or services, sorry, services, then there are, you could use PowerShell. There are other ways to do this, right? On the other hand, if you're casually just kind of poking through or you're trying to troubleshoot an issue, services.msc is a good way to go. Okay. So like I said, malware, malicious processes, they often try and hide, often in the service host processes because there's so many of them that people just kind of like we just gloss over them. That's not the only way though. Service host isn't the only way that they can hide. They can hijack any service potentially, and they could just install a service if they want to. Okay. So some management that you can do with services, you can through services.msc, you can start, stop, pause, or restart them. Okay. You can pass parameters to them, which change their behavior. And in fact, that's what Service Host does. If you look at the command line options for Service Host, each of them is launched with a different parameters, but it's still the same executable, right? So each of them is doing a different thing based on the parameters that are passed, you know. You can change the account under which the service logs on with. So there are different accounts that can be used. Some are more powerful than others. Some of them are intentionally weak. By weak, I mean they can't do much on the system. So that if they get hacked, nobody cares. You know, well, not that you don't care, but it mitigates the impact of getting hacked, right? And then you can also configure recovery options. So if a service fails, if it crashes for because of a buffer overflow, let's just say, what happens after that? Does it just lie there like a beetle on the floor, not being able to do anything on its back? Or, does it try and recover and start up again? That kind of thing, right? It is possible to export a list of the services as a CSV file, but like I said, there are better ways of doing it with something like PowerShell. PowerShell can also export that information as a CSV file. So, it's really up to you what you want to do and what you're more comfortable with. I'm just going to see if I can go to my virtual machine here. Ah, there we go. Okay, so I'd rather just poke around a little bit. Okay, so Microsoft hides a whole bunch of stuff in services, right? And you can sort them by name, but you can also sort them by the status of whether they're, let me just change that, whether they're running or whether they're not running, whether the startup type is manual versus, that's weird. Hold on a second. Versus automatic versus delayed automatic or automatic delayed versus disabled. Okay. So let me just give an example here. I'll choose an example in a second. And then if you expand this out a little bit, who it is that the service is running as. Okay. So you're going to notice if I just sort through that, there's local service, which is quite a lot. And then there's local system. And then there's network service. Okay. Those are the three kind of, the trifecta of accounts that are likely running all of your services. It's actually possible to put in different accounts if you want to. Okay, so if I just sort by name, let me just switch that over. Um, who cares? Okay. Uh, da, 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 da. I don't really want to mess with one that's important. Spatial SNMP trap. Sure. Okay. So this is a manual service, right? That means that it's not running when the system boots up. It doesn't start up automatically. It has to be turned on by some kind of process. Okay. It's running as the local service, and if I'm interested in it, I can double click on it. There's a nice description here, which is also listed here. Okay. When I double click on it, it opens up this new window, and I can get a lot more details. Okay, so it tells me exactly where that process is. I can change the startup type. The four types of startup I have are automatic delayed, automatic, manual, and disabled. Okay. So I could just go and say, this is disabled, and I'm going to go apply. Okay. And now I can go, hey, I want to turn this on. Oh, I can't. It's disabled. Okay. If I go back and I turn it back to manual, now I can start it. And so there are times when services, you just don't want them to run anymore. Maybe they're causing a problem. Maybe they're a security issue. You can just disable them so long as they're not essential, you know? If they are essential, they're probably running in the background already. But it is something to bear in mind and watch out for. Okay. So like I said, I could manually start this. Here's where I would pass any parameters that I might want to. Okay. Uh, if that's something that I need to do. And in logon, we can see that the local service is what's running. That was already listed here. So that's the account that is running this service. This is not a special account. And if I wanted to, I could change this to local system. Okay. And here's where if I allow it to interact with the desktop, basically I'm violating that rule that services and humans don't interact, right? So this is not something I typically want to do. Now, if we go back to the account, I can actually select different accounts to run as, and I could even put in, uh, I think I've got a tech account here. I can put in a user account if I want to. Oops, it doesn't like that one. Maybe it's not tech. Maybe it's just admin. Yeah, there we go. I can put in any account I want, right? And then I just have to provide the proper password for it. I don't want to do that because this is actually a real system service. I'm just going to cancel that. But the fact of the matter is, you can create your own service accounts if you like to, right? And you can limit them so that they can't really do anything. But that's the purpose of some of these already. Local service, where is that? SNMP trap. The local service here, it's basically a nobody account. It's an account that exists on the system. It's kind of like a regular user, not an administrative user, and it has no access to the network. Okay. So there's a very limited amount of damage it can do on the system when it's running. So if this service gets hacked by somebody, it doesn't have the ability to change passwords on the system. All it can do is manipulate the files associated with local service. Okay, so anything local service owns, it would be able to manipulate. Okay, network service is another example of a low privileged account. The difference being that local service is meant to be local and network service is meant to go out onto the network. Okay. So if I'm running, say, I don't know, like a web service that needs to be able to communicate with users, I could run that under network service. Like, let's just say printing services, right? I don't want to run it as an administrative account or anything too powerful. So I'll run it as network service. Now let's just kind of change, we'll sort by log on. And if we go down to network service, you'll see that a lot of the ones that are associated with network service are ones that are answering requests from online entities. One moment. Ooh. So fax service, for example, that's receiving some requests uh, from outside remote procedure call. This is all stuff that's listening on ports, right? Uh, Telephony, these are all running as even Windows Media Player, right? Which is a little weird, but it's because it's potentially casting out to other people. DNS client, all that. The local service can't do the things that it needs. And so we created this other account called network service, which can talk on the internet or over the local area network. Now, the difference is basically local service cannot go out onto the network. When network service goes out onto the network, let's say it connects to a machine or it talks to another host, it will always appear as, at least in a Windows domain, as the computer object. Okay. So it's taking on the identity of the Active Directory machine, you know? So in terms of a security incident, if you're trying to track down log files, if a computer is connecting to your machine and you're seeing that in the log files, that's the machine acting through the network service. Okay. So that'll always show up as machine name $sign, you know? Now, beyond that, you've also got something called local system, and you can see that there's a lot of those, okay? So people often confuse local service with local system. Local service is weak. Local system is more powerful than the administrator. It's essentially the operating system, okay? So all of these other ones, the reason that they're running as local system is because for some reason that service needs those elevated privileges, okay? You know, I would kind of quibble on some of this because I'm not sure that that's really always the case. Windows installer, I could totally see that needing the local system. That makes a lot of sense. Windows backup, yeah, I could see that too. Um, does VMware Tools really need to run as the local system? I would question that, you know. I might be wrong about it, but I think there's a tendency for developers to just say, you know what, it works when I give myself full rights, just leave it like that. And so that introduces security concerns, you know. If you don't have to run with elevated privileges, you should, as a developer, you should drop those rights as much as possible, right? But often they don't because they're trying to get it to work, and when they finally get it to work, they don't want to go any further. They're usually like, okay, it's good, don't mess with it. You know how that feels, kind of, but you got to resist that feeling, right? Now, going on into some other things. So we talked about this already. This password for the accounts, you don't manage that password. You never get to see it. It's just managed by the system. Okay. So local service, network service, those aren't passwords that you typically set. You don't really want to mess with that. Okay. Recovery. In case of failure, what do you do? Well, you can restart the service. You could take no action. You can run a program. That could be something like an email being sent, like an alert, right? Or if you want to prank somebody, you could restart the computer. So as soon as the service stops, the whole system's going to restart, you know? Um, not necessarily the best thing in the world, but usually restart the service is the first thing you're going to do. Now, they actually have multiple failure events. So if there's a second failure, it's going to try again. And in this case, they're like, third failure, I give up. You know? Right? But if you really wanted to, that's where you could run a program and do something to alert somebody about it, you know? Reset count after however many days. That seems rather extreme. Restart service after a minute, right? So in other words, if there's something that went wrong, give it a minute and then try again. Okay. Or go to the first failure. Then if it still fails, give it a minute, go to the second failure. Dependencies. This is important in terms of which services start first, second, third, etc. Right? Some of them it doesn't matter. Some of them you control by just the idea of when they start up. So if I have something that starts up automatically, it's going to start up when the machine starts up. If I start up something automatic delayed start, it's going to wait until the system settles, then it's going to start it up. Okay. And so let's just take the automatic ones. We'll ignore the rest. If you have something that's starting up automatically, then you're going to have quite a few of those. Which are the ones that go first, second, third, all that kind of stuff, right? The way that you decide that is through the dependencies. So let's just go up to automatic here. So let's see. I just want to find one that has dependencies. So yeah, he's got none. Okay. User profile service. That would be pretty important. Yeah. Okay. So the user profile service, that's what lets you log on, essentially, right? Now it depends on a remote procedure call. So if you don't have that running already, then you can't start this profile service because it needs it in order to function. Okay. So what that means is because this is configured as a dependency, when the user profile service is called to start, it's going to check and say, is RPC running? And if it's not, I'm going to hold off and wait, and we're going to wait for this to start up first, then we'll proceed. Okay. So that just prevents any kind of catastrophic failures because dependencies aren't being met. There's also services that rely on this service. Okay, so the ones that are enumerated are application information, natural authentication, shared PC account manager, and the user manager. None of these are going to be able to start until the user profile service is running. Okay, and so we can check that um, these are registered and they're just going to sit there waiting until this is functioning. Sometimes, let's say the user manager service isn't loading and it keeps failing. Okay. When you dig down, you might find that the reason it's failing is because the user profile service is failing, right? So you may be chasing the original cause of a failure. You might notice it in one place, and then it turns out that the cause of that failure is a dependency not being met further down the chain of services. Okay. All right. Okay. So that kind of covers quite a bit there. There's automatic, manual. We talked about that, disabled, and automatic delayed. Why does automatic delayed occur versus just automatic? They just found that sometimes there's contention, um, and there are some services that are kind of heavy, like say SQL, you know, um, or what have you, where it's like, I really don't need this service running right out of the box. It doesn't have to compete with the others. So we're going to introduce a delay. Once all the other automatics start up, then he'll get into the queue with any of the other automatic delays, and he won't interfere with the more crucial services, you know? So that's why that was introduced. It's a little bit weird because in the registry, and there is a registry location for starting services. Uh, there's a registry value for the startup type, which is automatic, manual, or disabled. There is no automatic delayed. It's actually an extra registry value on the side, which you have to add in, which indicates it's not just automatic, but it's automatic with a delay put in. Okay. So this was like a after the fact tweak of services that they seem to have introduced just because they found it was useful. Okay. Okay, local system account, I talked about him pretty much. Um, let's see, if service logs on to the local system account on a domain controller, there's something to watch out for. That service basically controls the domain. So if you get malware running as a service on your DC, it essentially controls your domain at that point, or it has the ability, right? So this is the big daddy you want to watch for, but there are plenty of services running as local system. That means that those better be secure services, right? Now, the local service account, that's the weak one that's really restricted to your system. Anything that it tries to do on the network is going to show up as a null session with no credentials. So in other words, it has no identity over the network. It can still do things like fetch something from the internet, right? It's just that it can't actually authenticate in Active Directory or over Windows, right? Like NTLM or anything like that. So it does have some networking capability, but it can't identify itself in any way, which means it's quite limited. Network service, like I said, it shows up as the computer account in Active Directory. That's how it will show up in the log files. Again, local service will show up as a null session in the log files. Okay. I went through all of this pretty much, so that's not too big a deal. Service security improvements. Yeah, so when did they introduce some of these concepts? Windows XP Service Pack 2 is when they really started thinking, we shouldn't run everything as the local system because there were so many hacks that had occurred, especially with Windows 2000. Like IIS, for example, used to run as the local system. That's a terrible idea. And they learned that the hard way, but that was the early days of the internet for us, really, right? So, but hackers figured out holes in IIS and then they took advantage of them and gained administrative access, right? And so they were like, yeah, we really got to run these things without elevated privileges. So with IAS, they've taken it to a whole new level these days, where they're only using pseudo accounts. They're not even using um, network service anymore. They've actually dropped it down to, I can't remember what they're called anymore, but they're not real accounts. They're just kind of virtual accounts that are just used for IAS pretty much. So that's even better. It's even better than going off of network service, you know? Okay, so that's services in a nutshell, but I do want to get into some command line stuff a little bit. Just give me a second here. Go back to our trusty virtual machine. There's a few things that you can do. I thought I had, I guess I removed the service. I don't know. I thought I had a service I could play with here that wouldn't cause any harm. Oh, I could do this one. That'll work. Let me just check. It's called. Okay, now here's the thing. You've got the display name, like the handy, friendly name, Sisyphus Reboot Service, right? Um, Now, that's not what you use to interact with it when you're dealing with uh, PowerShell or anything like that. Okay. So you want the service name, which is different from the friendly name. So I call it the Sisyphus Reboot Service, but it's actually rboot SVC. Okay. You're going to find that's the case with a lot of these. And if you're interacting with them over any kind of command line, then you're going to find that it's going to want that, that service name rather than the friendly name. All right, so I do get service. It'll list everything for me. And so I could actually extract a lot of useful information just using PowerShell, right? This is, um, you know, let me just see. I wonder if I can just type rboot svc. So here I do get service rboot svc. It shows me the status, it's stopped. It shows me its name and the display name. And if I want to, um, I can expand on that, right? That'll give me a little bit more detail. Okay. So you can actually do a huge dumping of all the services using PowerShell, but there are other command tools that you can use as well. Okay. So I could start dash service rboot svc. And now if I just do a get service, whereas before it was stopped, now I can see that it's running, right? If I want, I could just stop the service. Okay. Now, I can also use some older school commands. So if I just go into the command prompt here, I could do net start rboot service. Okay. And that's going to do pretty much the same thing. Oops. Now I can't quite, I think it's net query. I might be wrong about that though. So give me a second. No, it's net user. Hmm. No, I can't quite remember it. So there's start and there's stop. No, that doesn't really give me a stat. I thought there was like a status or something. There's not. So I'll just do stop. I think what I'm thinking of is the SC command. Okay, so I can also start and stop with the net commands. Those are like pretty universal. You can run those on like XP if you want to. There's also the SC command. So if you type SC slash question mark, this is service control. That's what it stands for. Oh, that's where the query is. Okay. So I could do SC query, and I think I just put rboot svc. and it'll give you information about the process. Right now it's currently stopped. I could do SC start, rboot service, start pending, and then I could do an SC query, and now it's running. And then I could just stop it again, right? Okay. Now, I can also do an SC config, and this is where SC is kind of handy. However, it doesn't play nicely with PowerShell. So you have to be a little cautious about this. This is something you'd have to run in the command line. So you're either kind of doing PowerShell uh, with its own set of commands dealing with services, or else you're dealing with command.exe, but there's some pretty robust features that you could do with SC here. So I could say SC config, rboot service, start equal, I think I have to put a space, disabled. Okay. And it tells me, yeah, I've changed the startup type. So if I just close that and I go back to it, it says that it's disabled. It doesn't say it here, but if I refresh it, I'll just hit F5 maybe. It does show it. Okay. So there are ways in script that you can actually, or in the command line, that you can actually play around with things. SC is a little bit picky, so it does require start equal followed by a space, and then you have to actually say what you want, right? If I want to change that from disabled, I could do what is it? Well, there's automatic, first of all. No, doesn't like that one. Delayed auto. Oh, it's just auto. So at least it tells me. But so this is what I have to set it to send it to auto. If I just hit an F5, now it's on automatic. If I want delayed auto, I got to put delayed dash in front there. So it's got its own little quirks. It's good to know about the different ones that are available, right? The next thing is I just want to point out, if I can find it. Let's see. So HK local machine system. I'm going to say current control set. I might be wrong about that. Oh, services. Here we go. Okay. So this is actually in the registry where all the services are located. So if we go over to our rboot service, where are you? RDB, there we go. Oops, and I lost it. There we are. If we go here, we can actually see the registry settings. Okay. So here we've got the startup type, which is set to 2. Okay. Now I'll just show you and who it's running as. Local system, a little bit too powerful. Now let's just go back to the command line here. And what I want to do is just change one of these values again. So we're going to go from delayed auto to disabled. Okay. So if I change that and then I F5 this, the startup type has changed to the value 4. Okay. So if I just change that registry value, I'll also change the behavior of the service. Okay. You can also see there's description and display name. I could change those through the registry as well, rather than having to go through anything in the command line, right? Now, let's say I want to change this to auto. Okay, let's just do that. Hit F5. This is changed to 2, right? Now, let's go back and change it to automatic delayed. This is something I wanted to point out. So now it's changed to automatic delayed. Let's refresh. It's still 2, right? What you see is that there's this delayed auto start as a separate key, which is set to 1. Okay. So there's actually two different keys that kind of provide some information. So if I go back and I put this to auto and I refresh, this is set to 0. This remains at 2. So delayed auto is actually a subtype of auto. Okay. And it's not covered by this start value. It's covered by this delayed auto start value here. If I go over and I set this to disabled again, let's just set it to automatic delayed first. Okay, so F5, this goes to 1, this goes to 2. Now if I go and I set this to disabled again, and I hit F5, this resets back to 0. Okay, so it's like we're not even talking about delayed auto anymore. But this is set over to 4 because it's not an automatic startup anymore. Okay, so these are things that you have to watch out for. There's other stuff that you might have to watch out for as well. Um, I don't know if I have a good example of that, but basically different services can have different information, right? They don't all contain the same stuff. Yeah, here's an example. There's also a parameters area where you can have other information filled in. So it's, it's not all one thing where it's exactly what you expect it to be. You might have to research uh, different fields within the registry to get information and what does what, you know. But you can poke around with these things, and it can often be useful to figure out what is the service doing, what happens, when you change its behavior, how does that affect the registry, how does the registry affect it, you know? Okay, so that's services. Everybody ready to move on, or any questions about that? Because our next thing is browsers. Excuse me. Yeah, let's do this then. Yeah, well, oh, that was a little too much. Okay. So in this lesson, we're going to talk about cookies and web browser history, the level of privacy you can expect in a browser, which honestly isn't that much. The benefits and limitations of in private / incognito browsing. There's different marketing names used. So I'm just giving you a couple here. And what kind of tools you can use to look at browser activities. There are different tools out there. It's a bit of a mess because there's so many different browsers out there. Not all of them are going to be. What is that? That's good to say. It's a kitty with a cookie. Aw. It's a badly drawn kitty, but There we go. Peaches. Okay. One moment. I'm a little verklempt. Oh, wait, browse. I like that. That's a good one. A web browser. Uh, okay, so web browsers, they play an important role in investigations because people use them so much, right? So a lot of the stuff that they're doing is done on the browser, but there's so many varieties out there. So we have IE, which is kind of dead, but still hanging on in largely in kind of public sector circles, I would say, and big enterprises where they don't change things too quickly. Okay. But you've also got Edge, which is much more current. You got Chrome, Firefox, Safari, Opera, Brave, you name it, right? It keeps on going, right? A lot of them, though, that's only an apparent diversity, because a lot of them are built out of the same WebKit, which is the one that Chrome works off of, right? The only one I know that actually isn't is Firefox. The rest of them are all built off of the Chrome development kit, essentially, you know? So that means they do have a lot of commonalities, but they've got a lot of differences too, which you can see just looking at Chrome versus Edge, you know? There's a similarity, you can feel it, but the implementation changes. Okay. So web browsers, they go back a long way. There are some that are long dead now, like Netscape, but they've always played an important role in the internet. And Netscape was the first big daddy uh, to kind of make a big splash on the scene. IE obviously was a big one too. And then later on, we got Firefox, Chrome, and Opera, and many others. Okay, so IE is end of life. Even Microsoft has given up the ghost at this point, where they're actively encouraging you to move off of it on servers, right? And then they came out with their own version of MS Edge, and then they seemed to struggle to get people to adopt it, and they found it was a pain to maintain. And then they forked Google Chrome, and they've been doing that ever since, right? So the new Edge is not like the original MS Edge, which they came out with, which was a complete rebuild. Instead, it's just kind of a flavor of Chrome, essentially. And I'll be honest with you, I'm not really a fan of either of them, but I use Edge for work purposes, and I use Firefox at home. That's what I do at the moment. Um, I like Firefox. I don't love Firefox, but I also don't have a lot of browsers that I do like, you know. I really just want the browsers to get out of my way. Now, they can provide a lot of information about what you've been doing because there's so much data that gets stored to improve your experience that can then be used to recreate what you've been doing, right? So there's your browser cache, which improves response times. There's cookies that are stored, as we were seeing here, and history, right? All of that is being maintained for your convenience. But then when an investigation comes along, that can actually give us some pretty useful information. So the thing is, they're all stored in different locations depending on your browser. That's where the variations come in. And so if you're doing an investigation, you kind of have to know where this stuff is stored, and it's not all stored in the same formats. Okay. And so you might need different tools to look into things, and even different versions of the same browser. You'll see that there are variations in how this is done, right? So here's an example. I'm going to point out internet options. This is something from IE. You might look at it and say, but it's actually built into the operating system. Okay. So it used to be that IE was much more tightly integrated with the OS. And so nowadays, when you're using, say, MS Edge, internet options don't come into play quite as much, but they're still needed because it is still part of the OS. Okay. So, if you went into the general tab and you were trying to clear your browsing history and stuff like that, well, that's not going to happen with MS Edge. Okay. That will work for IE. However, if you go into security or if you go into connections, both of those impact Edge and Chrome and all of that kind of stuff. Okay. Because that's where you're actually setting up zone security, and that's OS wide. Okay, so even though this is an old school interface and it's typically kind of associated with IE, there's settings in here that you might want to investigate and see whether they're configured a certain way. Okay. If you go to something like Firefox, they're not really impacted by this. If you go to Chrome, less so as well. But if you're using MS Edge or you're using IE, it's still going to have an impact. Okay, so here's the security tab where you've got your internet, your local intranet, the trusted sites, and the restricted sites. So anything that you pop into those zones is going to change the behavior of your browser, right? When it's dealing with that site. Okay. So all of these settings still take effect. It doesn't matter what browser you're using in terms of Microsoft's offerings. For connections, if you're setting up any kind of um, dial-up or VPN settings, you can do that here. That still has an impact for modern browsers. Okay. So that is something to pay attention to. But going beyond that, if you go into useful edge settings, I'm skipping the old school edge that's been deprecated and thrown away. This is just the one that's based off of Chromium, right? But some useful settings is privacy search and services and cookies and site permissions. Okay. Um, Now, here, when you're deleting browser history, this is just an example in IE, but usually you have different options of what you can delete, right? So I am showing IE, but you can also do that in Edge as well, or any of the other ones. You got to poke around a little bit to find where it is exactly. Now, when you're looking through history, something to remember, the fact that a URL shows up in the history doesn't always mean that the person intentionally visited that site. It could be an ad pop-up. It could be that they just kind of clicked on the wrong link by mistake. So it doesn't always show intentionality. It just shows what the browser did, right? Now, if you're trying to clear your tracks, you can go through something like this and you can check off the areas where you want to delete your data. Maybe you want to keep your passwords because they were saved, but you do want to get rid of your temporary internet files, for example. Maybe you don't want to get rid of your cookies because you've got some useful ones set in there. Okay. So users have some options, and that's often where people make mistakes. They may not clear the things that need to be cleared. Okay. In Firefox, you have privacy and security. You can clear your history, and you'll get a similar pop-up to what we just had there. Okay. You could also clear off remembering your history if you want to as well. Let's see. Yeah, so this is the pop-up when you're choosing what you want to clear. And it's a similar kind of, you could check off cookies versus browsing history, etc. Okay. Now, cookies. Cookies are small text files deposited on system by web servers. So the idea here is they're used to identify you and your, basically to reduce the amount of pestering that a site has to do. Um, the original reason that they did them was to take the load off of servers, to be honest. So you're not constantly dialing back to the server with more requests. Instead, the server goes and asks you and says, "Hey, give me this information," right? And then your browser just presents the cookie. It answers all the questions, and there's nothing else to do, right? So it makes future access to the sites a little more smoother. However, this also gets used extensively to track what you do, right? So this is not just investigations, this is advertising, which is why when you visit sites, I don't know, you're looking at a sweater and all of a sudden you get a lot of advertisements about sweaters. It's because all of this stuff is being aggregated quite a bit. So because it's not just being stored on your computer, it's actually being requested and used by the server, and then that gets aggregated by people who are looking to sell to you, right? However, it can provide valuable forensic evidence about what sites you're spending time on, and what you're doing on those sites at what time, you know. Now, where these are stored, that depends on the browser. And it depends on the OS to some degree. So third-party utilities are the way to go. And sometimes you have to go and get one specially for a particular type, like say Safari, right? Um, Safari only runs on Mac. You're probably going to have to get an individual application that's going to work with that. Okay? So where are these cookies we speak of? IE, you can just type shell cookies in the command run. And that'll take you to the location where your cookies are stored. Okay, so app data, local, Microsoft, Windows, iNet cookies, right? Firefox, you go into settings, privacy and security, cookie and site data. You can manage your data there. Okay. It does have a location. It's kind of like a SQLite database where it can store this information. Uh, and you can access that directly, but usually Firefox itself is a good way just to get into that information. But if you want to take it offline, you could do that too. Okay, so in this case, when I want to manage cookies and site data, you can actually search for particular patterns and you can see what kind of cookies there are available. And then you could delete them if you want to. You may want to inspect them. That's again where third-party apps come in. Okay. Uh, Chrome, not shell dash cookies. You want to go into privacy and security again, and you can clear your browsing data or you can poke around a little bit. So you want to head over to the advanced section. Let's see, Edge, very similar. Cookies and site permissions, manage and delete cookies and site data, see all cookies and site data, and then you can start poking around. Okay. Now, browser investigations, when you're actually starting to try and reconstruct what somebody's doing, um, this can be made challenging by the use of the clearing of a browser history, deleting of cookies, deleting of temporary internet files, right? So if we're trying to figure out what someone's done, they may manually do a lot of these things. They may set it up so that every time they close their browser, that's what happens. But one of the most common tools that people use is incognito or in private browsing, right? Now, there's kind of, how do I put this? You know, people who are security minded, they might talk about using incognito or something like that, and they're like, I always do this, and blah 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 blah. But the fact of the matter is, even this private browsing stuff is not that private. Okay. In fact, Google just got sued, and they had to pony up some decent money because their incognito feature, they were still studying what people were doing. You know? So they didn't apply it to themselves, you know? And I would fully expect that most of the browsers out there are also tracking you. Okay. I'm not so sure about things like Brave and Firefox. I know that they have some scruples about these kind of things a little bit more, but that could also, those scruples could not be strictly honest as well, you know? So don't really expect that you're completely anonymous just because you're using in private browsing. Okay. So browsers store some info like your search history to improve performance and your experience. Uh, Typically, a lot of that stuff is just loaded into RAM when you're doing in private. And then when you close a window, it just disappears, you know, except for the stuff that they dial back and send as telemetry information for their own purposes, right? So in private browsing is only in effect during the time that you have a window open, okay? And only within that window. So here's an example with Firefox. They each have their terms. Here's incognito with Chrome, you know, here's in private browsing with Edge. All similar concepts with little details that are different. So what's the behavior of in private browsing? This is taken from IE, but I'd expect it would apply to Edge roughly. Okay. Cookies kept in RAM. So, you know, they're there and they're being used, but when you close the browser, they just disappear in a puff of smoke, right? Temporary internet files stored on disk, but deleted when you close your browser. So, uh, you know, they could still be recovered, right? Even if you delete them. Web page history, not stored. Form data, not stored. Anti-phishing cache, which could be used to get some information out of it. Uh, Temporary information, and it's encrypted. So it is there, but it's not that easy to get access to. Address bar and search autocomplete not stored, and any kind of crash that you might trigger to get a memory dump to look into this information. Um, you know, if the whole Windows crashes, then then it's all deleted and the window can't be restored, so you lose that. But people can't reconstruct what it was you were doing. Okay, in theory. So in private browsing doesn't mean that people can surf the web anonymously. It just means that it's harder to reconstruct what you did through the browser itself. Okay. You still leave lots and lots of little details around on the network, over the internet. Okay. If you have any kind of proxy server, any kind of caching that's going on, or if anybody has any kind of sniffer set up, whatever that might be over the network, keystroke logging, that kind of stuff, all of that will still register what you're doing. Okay, and so that could still be used to figure out what you've done. Now, some workplaces, they also have pretty advanced firewalls that'll do deep packet inspection. And so they can actually even look through encrypted traffic uh, if they control your machine, right? They can make sure that your certificates accept man in the middle, essentially, so that they can snoop on the traffic even when you think you're safe. That's one of the reasons I don't really recommend people do anything serious at work in terms of finance. Like, don't log in with your banking or anything like that, because all of that is actually recorded, potentially, and it's possible to snoop so long as they completely control the network environment. Okay. So the investigator with these methods, they could still get hold of web browser history data just by tracking the machine externally, okay, and the path that it goes through to go out to the internet. So in that sense, in private browsing may provide a false sense of anonymity. Um, Now, after the history is cleared, so if you clear your histories in IE, there's even this, no one's using this anymore, but uh, for decades and decades with IE, they kept this file called index.dat for every single user um, on the system. So before Edge came out, if you weren't using another browser, if you were just sticking with IE, they were tracking every single thing that you were doing. Okay. So IE10 and later, it started out with an index.dat file. They renamed it at various times, but it's still a DAT file which stores a bunch of information about what you do. So URLs of all the sites that you visited, including dates and times, downloaded files, and forms. Lists of the cookies placed on your PC, lists of searches you've done when you cleared your history. All of this was being stored in this DAT file. Okay. This is user specific. Now, Microsoft said it was a cache, right? But really, it, it's it's not that easy to gain access to the information, but it's not that hard either if you're technical. And so it really did, like I would say it was a violation of privacy, and you couldn't turn it off. There's no way not to use it. So that informs me, certainly with MS Edge, that they're probably doing something very similar, you know? And we know that Google has been snooping on incognito sessions, like they actually track all that information too. So you got to be rather jaded and cynical about all of this stuff, really. Now, where was this actually stored? In IE10 and IE11, sorry, in Windows 10 with IE11, you could go to App Data, local Microsoft Windows web cache, and you could get your webcache.dat file there. The recent versions of Edge are based on Chromium, so they act more like Google. You have to look at how Google works. Okay. Um, and so we don't have that clear example anymore, but you could still pull out dust off IE to get an idea of what information they actually do keep. So how did investigators get data out of these files? Well, this was a locked file, these DAT files. So as soon as a user logs in, it would be locked for exclusive use by the system, right? Um, now, there were different things that you could do. You could do a volume shadow copy procedure to take a copy of it. That's a little convoluted, but it's not that big a deal. And then there are third-party utilities where actually there's just a service which is putting a lock on that DAT file. You disable the service or turn it off, and then you can grab the file, and then you can turn it back on again. Okay. So there's a tool from Nearsoft called Browsing History View, which will offer to do that for you if you're looking to get information from IE. Um, just if you're interested in poking around a bit. Now, if you want to go a little more into the paranoid world, there's also the Onion Router or Tor, also known as Tor. And this is just based on Firefox. Okay. It's a browser which has been reconfigured to work on what they call the dark web, right? But really, it's just the Tor network, right? Um, so it's just Firefox reconfigured to be more aggressively private, but also to allow onion networking. Okay. So users of the Tor network, they have their traffic basically bounced around all over the place. It slows down performance in terms of getting replies, but it increases your anonymity quite a bit. Okay. So it's not so much that all of your data is encrypted. It is encrypted, but it's only encrypted in transit. Okay. But the reason that it's encrypted in transit is so that people can't tell where you're coming from. Okay. So the traffic details are the part that's encrypted, not your actual messages. And so if you're not careful about what you're saying in your transmissions, even though they can't tell where you're coming from, if you're too open about details, they can figure out who you are, right? And one way that they can do that is these Tor routers that get set up to create these networks. There have been like the FBI, the CIA, they've actually introduced their own routers into these networks, and anybody who's passing data through their routers, they can sniff the traffic, right? So there is no encryption at the router level. The routers are the ones doing the encryption. So if they throw in a router into this network, as anyone that they're helping to bounce around, they can see the traffic, right? They don't know where you came from, but they can see everything that you're saying. Okay, so this is something to watch out for. Some people they think if they're using Tor, oh, I'm completely, I'm completely secure. No, it's not. It's more like anonymous. And the more you talk about yourself, the less anonymous you are, right? So there are many democracy activists and criminals and criminal democracy activists around the world who use Tor because they're worried about consequences, you know. But many of them also fail to realize that it's not fully encrypted, like it is possible to snoop. So law enforcement has succeeded in catching people onto our networks because they're being a little too loose-lipped. Okay. So you are protected in terms of where your communications are coming from, but they can see what you're transmitting. So you need to introduce further encryption if you can. And if you can't, you need to be careful about what you're saying. Okay. So the main takeaway here is that even with anonymizing networks, which are geared towards this kind of thing, you can't just like sit back and relax. If you're doing something that has a high price, if you're caught doing it for whatever reason, um, it warrants being paranoid even then. Okay. Now, the tool that we're going to play with it's the best one I've seen so far. It's the browsing history view. I've used other ones in the past, and often they're specific to a particular browser. So there's one for Chrome, there's one for Edge, there's one for Firefox. It gets a little tiring having to track all of those down for different versions of um, different browsers. But this one, it's well maintained. They release new ones periodically, and it supports lots and lots of browsers. Okay, so uh, I have us work with this one, and you could try it out on different browsers that you have. If you use something a little exotic, maybe give it a try. You know, uh, but they allow you to look at things like cookies. Um, that's mostly where we're actually playing around with. It'll tell you what you've surfed to and all as well. And it'll let you get to those .dat files, i.e. if you want to, it'll stop the service and access it. As you can see here, this is actually working with Safari, IE, Chrome, and Firefox all at the same time. Okay. So, I mean, that's not the only game in town, but it is the best one I've come across. And I think it's enough just to work with one for our purposes. But do keep in mind that you may have to go further out, further afield, to work with it. Like if you're on a Linux system, you're not going to be able to use that tool. You have to come up with something else, right? Okay. Any questions before I set you loose? It's a lot of talking. I know. I felt it too. Does VPN work the same as Tor? No, not at all. um, Okay, there's two ways that VPN can work. So there's the professional way, which is, I'm at home and I want to get into work, and they want me to connect directly to their network, and they're going to set up an encrypted tunnel. Okay. So rando person from the internet authenticates to get into the private network. That's the original use of VPN technology. Okay. What they've done with the VPNs that get sold nowadays, it's an anonymizing VPN, is that they flip it around. So you're a rando and you're using your VPN to get out to the internet. Okay. So there's a third party that's acting as an intermediary for you. You're going through an encrypted tunnel to connect to them, and then you end up, it's kind of like a wormhole. You end up on some other part of the internet where you then continue to browse, right? So with those types of VPNs, what they're really saying is if you set up this VPN, let's say you're at work, okay, you set up a VPN in this sense, um, your employer will not be able to snoop on your traffic, okay? And that's because you have an encrypted tunnel going to this third party that you've paid for. But once you get out of that, so once you're actually surfing the net, you go through their network, and then you're going out, and everything's unencrypted afterwards. Okay, so you might be appearing to come from, I don't know, England, let's say, right? That's why things like Netflix, you can bypass location, like regional limitations, is because you seem to be coming from somewhere else, right? Now, the downside from a privacy perspective is that all of your initial traffic is going through that VPN. So it's a question of whether you trust the VPN provider because they're concentrating all of your requests through them. If they're tracking you, then you're fully tracked. You know? Like there's no variety. You're always going through their tunnel. Yeah. Now Tor is different. Tor is like totally distributed. It's the exact opposite. You can go through a whole bunch of different nodes and you get bounced around randomly. It slows down your traffic, but it does increase your anonymity significantly. Okay. On the other hand, like if you try and use that at Nate, they're not going to support Tor. They'll shut it down, right? Because they see that as like malware. It's not really malware, but they don't want to be associated with it because there are criminals who use it, right? So, so can we combine both Tor and VPN? If a VPN provider is hosting on Tor, I guess you could do that. Yeah, that would work. I don't know if the experience would be very good. I think, you'd have a slower connection, um, and you wouldn't have any further privacy from the VPN provider, right? I think your best bet is really to use Tor with SSL for whatever site you're going to. That's about as good as you can get, really. The SSL will protect you. That's what I would recommend. I don't use VPNs. Um, I just I think they're a bit of a not a scam, but they're marketed in a way which I don't think quite accurately represents their utility. You know, I think you're really concentrating a lot of it. It's kind of like um, it's kind of like if you only do your banking with a single bank. You know, you're concentrating your risk in a single place. That's my opinion with VPNs. I think it's better just to use SSL in general, and if you want anonymity, use Tor, and be careful about what you say. You know, so okay, yeah. So exercises. Processes and services. No, I think I've already kind of mentioned processes and services. So you've already been set to task on that. Um, Email and internet investigations. What I'm going to say here is there's one big exercise, web email and forensics. Just do the parts that are related to web. Don't do the email stuff right now. Okay. Because we're going to come across it later. We're not going to use it in this next lab. We're just going to use the web stuff. Um, when we come back to that, I'll remind you to go back and do the web part, the email part of this exercise further down the road. Okay. So there's this PDF to do and a bunch of tools to download, but you can ignore any of the ones that are related to email for now. Okay. And that'll show up in the document when you actually read through it. You say, okay, skip, skip, skip. Oh, this is the web section. Let's do that. Okay. Okay. I'm going to go grab another coffee if there's no further questions. Coffee it is. Have a good one. And if you leave, I'll catch you later. Have a good weekend. Yeah, take it easy.